Good morning, wonderful students of period number 2 and period number 5. It is our second update of the week. Let's see who looked at the last update. Over here, we've got 9 people in period 2. Thank you, MD. Thank you, Angie. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Thais. Thank you, Christian. And thank you, Grace. Let's take a look over at period 5 and see who participated there. 8 people. Thank you, David. Thank you, Angelica. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Janine. And thank you, Edwin. All right. So, what's going on this update? First, tomorrow, Research Friday is due. Where does creativity come from and why do schools kill it off? This is as I hope you have already listened, wonderful podcast that discusses the nature of creativity, what we can do to cultivate it, how we can infuse our lives with more creativity. All of this is here. I really hope that you get an opportunity to listen and understand some of the concepts that are being presented. What are you going to do with this? I'm glad you asked. Let's take a look at this week's Research Friday questions. All right, let me blow this up a little bit. So, as usual, please listen to the podcast that synthesizes research. Synthesizes research. Synthesizes means you bring together multiple pieces of something. In this case, multiple pieces of research. That's what research papers do. And guess what? You, this month, are going to finish your research paper. So, let's talk about the questions that I'm asking you so that you can see where they coincide with parts of your research paper. So, answer these 3 questions. In fact, actually, I should have put these 4 questions because there's 4 questions. So, number 1, what does the podcast say about where creativity comes from? Remember, your research paper has to have a question. That's probably going to be your title. The research question of this podcast was, where does creativity come from? So, what does the what does the podcast say about where creativity comes from? This would coincide with the abstract and historical context of your research paper. Remember that your research paper is going to be divided into 4 sections. Your abstract, which is your synthesis of the main points in your essay, in your research project. We'll talk about that. Then there's the historical context, which gives us sort of the history leading up to the present of your subject. In this case, what are some of the thoughts on creativity and how have those thoughts evolved over time? What have people said about creativity going back to as early as you can discover, and then bringing that up to the present so that we have a background, we have a context for where your work lies. So, number 2, what are some of the different studies that the podcast mentions have been done on creativity? This coincides with the findings of your research paper. When it asks you what are some of the different studies, that's when they bring together synthesizing multiple sources, multiple studies, multiple researchers. What that is called the findings of your research. So when you bring together the 10 sources that you found, potentially the interview, potentially your survey results, when you bring those together, those are your findings. You've already written the majority of your findings because your findings are essentially the research cards that you've got. We'll talk about that when we do the findings section. Then, number 3, according to the podcast, what are schools doing wrong when it comes to creativity? This would also coincide with the findings section of your research paper. So I have two questions here about the podcast that if you ask these questions about your particular subject, the answers would essentially become your findings section. Then, according to the podcast, what can people do to be more creative? So, after they've presented research on the nature and the history and the experience of creativity, then that last question. So, based off all of these findings, so what? Right? Always ask that important question. So what? So what does this mean? So what does this imply? So what are we supposed to do? Right? That's your epilogue section where you discuss what the findings mean. So answer these 4 questions. Post your answers here. No one's posted any of them yet. They're not due till tomorrow, so don't worry about it. And take a look at your classmates' responses. I think it's really important for you to take a look at what it is that other people are doing in class, because we cannot have a class discussion physically because we're social distancing, we're staying at home, we're being protective of each other and of society. So where does creativity come from? Doesn't necessarily have to be just between you and the text box here. Instead, this idea of discussion can be between you and your classmates. And it would be really helpful for you to take a look at some of their responses on account of you're going to be making similar responses. And this really coincides with what all of you are going to do with your individual specific topics that you chose on the paper, the pieces of the paper that you're going to begin turning in next week. What pieces of the paper, you may be asking? I am so glad that you asked that. The very first one you can see is next Tuesday. The abstract, your rough draft, your historical context would do that Friday. Your research paper part 3, which is your findings, that is due a week from Tuesday, so almost 2 weeks from today. This is where this is all going. Let's look at the abstract. We're going to talk about that way more on Monday. That's Monday's lesson. Let me go over to I've got a little checklist here for your abstract so that you can make sure that you check all of these off to make sure you have them. I've got a little review on your abstract. What is your abstract? It's about 150 to 250 word paragraph. You've been used to writing pages every week for our blogs. You're only going to write a paragraph. This is coming. I'm previewing it. We're going to go over it in way more detail next update. But for now, thank you once again for listening. Thank you once again for participating. Thank you once again for being my students. I miss you all. I wish we were able to have class the way we used to have class, but we're making some sacrifices here. We're trying to do the right thing to make sure that all of us stay safe, stay healthy. This week, make sure we learn to stay creative. And we will meet again. Take care.